U.S. President Joe Biden has endorsed what he calls an Israeli proposal for a permanent ceasefire in Gaza. The plan would unfold in 3 phases and assure a permanent ceasefire, the return of Israeli hostages, and the reconstruction of Gaza. Hamas has released a statement saying it views the proposal positively. The office of Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has said it still wants to see the destruction of Hamas's military and governing ability. Here's Biden speaking from the White House.
This is truly a decisive moment. Israel has made their proposal. Hamas says it wants a ceasefire. This deal is an opportunity to prove whether they really mean it. Hamas needs to take the deal. I know there are those in Israel who will not agree with this plan and will call for the war to continue indefinitely. Some are even in the government coalition. I ask you to take a step back and think what will happen if this moment is lost. We can't lose this moment. It's time to begin this new stage. For the hostages to come home, for Israel to be secure, for the suffering to stop. It's time for this war to end.
Over to Benjamin Alvarez Gruber in Washington. Benjamin, tell us more about what's in this plan that Biden has just announced.
So President Biden laid out what he described as a 3-phase proposal for a ceasefire. The first phase involves a 6-week ceasefire when Israel forces would withdraw from what he called were all populated areas of Gaza. Some hostages would be freed in exchange for some Palestinian prisoners, and Palestinian civilians would return. Also, trucks of humanitarian aid would be allowed into Gaza. In the second phase, then Hamas and Israel would negotiate terms of a permanent end to hostilities, and the third phase will then include a reconstruction plan for Gaza. What President Biden said is that this was a proposal that was transmitted by Qatar to Hamas, and what we've heard that they would be open and were also willing and accepting and saying that they look further to also going in that direction.
Benjamin Netanyahu has repeatedly said that he won't stop until Hamas is completely destroyed. He's resisted calls, even from the U.S., for a ceasefire up to this point. What has changed?
That's right, and it's also interesting that it's the President of the United States and not the Prime Minister of Israel that presents this Israeli proposal, because just recently Israel said that it would not end the war in exchange for the hostages. And looking into the reactions and looking what the office of the Prime Minister of Israel also said to this proposal, and I quote, that it would also enable Israel to continue the war until all its objectives are achieved. And that, of course, sounds quite different to what President Biden said when he mentioned that this is the time for this war to end, and called on the Israeli leadership to resist pressure from those in Israel who were pushing for this war to go on and go on. President Biden almost implored Israelis to not miss the chance for a ceasefire. And it's not just the Israelis who have resisted calls for a ceasefire of the Israeli government, as we just need to remember the U.S. vetoing resolutions in the UN Security Council calling for humanitarian pauses to deliver aid to millions in Gaza.
Yeah, the war in Gaza, a tragedy on every side, but also a thorn in the side for this White House as the election approaches. What are the stakes for Biden in this proposal?
There's a lot of stakes for Biden, and what's important also for him to find this proposal and to push forward. We have seen pressure on the streets, many protest rallies. We have seen that also on U.S. college campuses across the country, but also increasing pressure from within the Biden administration to pressure Washington to change its position on the war in Gaza. Only on Thursday, 2 more U.S. officials resigned over the Biden's administration position on the war in Gaza. The officials accused the administration of not telling the truth about what they said was Israel's obstruction of aid to Palestinians in Gaza. And this is also about the credibility that the White House has. And just to mention 2 things, on one side, we have all seen those pictures of this $320 million expensive pier that the U.S. constructed in Gaza and that broke apart. And on the other side also, this announcement that a major offensive in Rafah by the Israeli Defense Forces would be Biden's red line, with many wondering what he meant by a major offensive, as Israel confirmed that its forces are in central Rafah and are expanding this offensive in the southern Gaza City.
All right, DW correspondent Benjamin Alvarez Gruber, thank you very much.
All right, we want to go now to our correspondent, Tania Krämer. She's in Jerusalem. Tania, good to see you. So tell us more about this plan. The U.S. president says that the plan was presented by Israel, right?
That's right. We understand it was given actually to the mediators, Qatar and Egypt, and also to Hamas earlier this week. And this proposal is something similar that we've been hearing weeks earlier, but those talks have broken down about 3 weeks ago. So this new proposal that is now on the table would see a deal in 3 phases. Now, the first phase would last about 6 weeks. It will include a full and complete ceasefire, temporary ceasefire, and that regard withdrawal from forces from all populated areas, and the release of a number of hostages, including women and elderly and the wounded, in exchange for, as he said, hundreds of Palestinian prisoners. Now, what is significant here is then when it would go into the second phase, during the first phase, Hamas and Israel would then indirectly continue to negotiate to come to this second phase. And that phase would last as long as they negotiate, and then to attain what was described as a ceasefire, that a cessation of hostilities permanently. And also this second phase then would include the release of hostages, of male soldiers and other hostages, living hostages. And that would then continue into a phase 3, which was mainly see the reconstruction of Gaza. Now, of course, the ball is now in Hamas's court, because their stance had also hardened in recent weeks, especially now with the offensive in Rafah going on. And they had always called for a complete cessation of hostilities to actually go into such a deal. But now, of course, both sides have to come back to the negotiation table. They have to decide to come back and hammer out the details of such a deal.
So this proposal, then, it looks like a roadmap to a version of peace that includes bringing the Israeli hostages home. How do you think that this is going to sit with Israelis?
Well, I think, first of all, I think for the families and relatives of those remaining hostages, this is good news, because they've just heard just yesterday the National Security Advisor saying that the war could carry on until at least the end of the year. And many here were asking, you know, what does that mean for any deal? But the US President Joe Biden, he also had a message to the Israeli government and also to Israelis, saying you have to put pressure on your leaders, because he also said that he knows that there are some in the cabinet that don't want to see an end to the war, that don't want to see Israel coming to a deal, and that there has to be made a decision to be made, and that this is very important at this stage. Also saying that basically Hamas is no longer capable of carrying out another October 7th attack, and that their capabilities have been degraded, meaning basically that Israelis can go forward now and end this war.
DW's Tania Krämer with the latest tonight from Jerusalem. Tania, thank you.